So now the state says, we have delivered a hospital to you, but go to the cornerstone of the old building, and it's usually written who built it. It does not say National Health Service. It is almost invariably one of the friendly societies. I'll leave you with one thing. When Ronald Coase did his study on the lighthouse, the argument was only the state can produce lighthouses. He went to do some research. He found out all lighthouses in the United Kingdom were built privately. They were nationalized by the state, after which no more lighthouses were ever built. But if you go and ask someone, they'll say, of course the state is necessary to build lighthouses. But as Coase pointed out in his research, it turns out it isn't true. They were built by private port developers, people who had docks, because they knew if the ship can't get to the dock because it crashes, I don't get any business. So in order to make sure I get business, they built lighthouses to guide the ships to be able to come into port. So all of those English lighthouses were privately produced. But after they were nationalized, they didn't make any more. And I think the welfare state is a bit like that as well. The real uplifting institutions were built by voluntary action. Once the state got in charge of them, they became institutions of dependency. Amin, I apologize for going over on the time. What should we do now?
Right, we're going to change the format a little bit. We're going to finish at about 20 past 6. But for now, we're not going into group discussion. We're going to open it into a question and answer session. So you can ask, preferably you can focus on the topic, but you can ask Tom anything about anything today if you want.
Anything about quantum mechanics, electrical engineering.
If I may, can I just add something
Yes.
about mutual aid groups, just to bring it back to the Malaysian context. If I were to give you an example, a living example that still exists today of how poor people, not necessarily poor people, but people who are not that rich, helping each other out of mutual consent. There's something in villages in Malaysia, especially among Muslims, who go to surau, to the small prayer called Khairat Kematian, death fund. It's basically a fund that people pay like 20 ringgit every month. These are villages, people who live in villages who don't necessarily have an income. They pay 20 ringgit, 50 ringgit a month to a fund administered by the mosque, the local mosque, the surau, not really mosque, the surau, and it's completely free from state control. It is administered by people who run the surau themselves. They will pay for anybody who dies. I don't have to know if I'm part of the group. I don't really have to know these people who has passed away. But the fund will be used to help them. We are helping each other without really knowing each other, and that's how an example of this mutual aid group. Just imagine what would happen if the government starts controlling that. Imagine how politicized it will be with you knowing how the mosques are already politicized now. So that's an example, of how good such a thing can be. So let's just open up the question.
Sir, Firdaus.
Since we argue that the state shouldn't be welfare state, if the state wishes to use its money for welfare purposes, should we propagate against it? That's my first question. My second question is, if the liberal view of a liberal state is better than a welfare state, I mean, if you're a devil's advocate, what are the negative side of it, really, if you were to have a more limited government and so on and so forth?
Look at the actual budget. The poor get almost nothing. As Walter Williams, an economist I mentioned, the very tall man who plays basketball, he's a very colorful explainer of these things. He says it's a bit like feeding sparrows. You know what sparrows are? They're very tiny little birds. You feed sparrows through the horse. Namely, you feed the horse a lot of grain. The grain comes out the other end of the horse, and then the sparrows can peck in it to find some seeds. Right? That's not a very efficient way of feeding sparrows. Horses think it's quite fine. What we're doing is feeding sparrows through the horse. If you want to feed the sparrows, give the sparrows some grain. But the welfare state is not about feeding the sparrows. It is overwhelmingly captured by middle and upper income groups. So a simple example would be in Germany, I was at a conference on German education reform a few years ago in Munich, and it was pointed out the debate was, should we have tuition payments, fees for universities? And the socialists say, no, 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 no. We must keep university free with no tuition so the poor can go. The economists pointed out, poor people don't go to German universities. If you want to find the most powerful statistical predictor of whether you go to university, it is whether your parents went to university. So what you have is a transfer from poor people who don't go to university to rich people who do. So the poor are paying for the education of the rich, and there's a big premium. If you have a university degree, you'll earn more money. The argument was, well, why shouldn't you pay for that then? You're going to have a lifetime of higher earnings, take out a loan and pay for your tuition. Why charge poor people to pay for it? So that's number one. The vast bulk of this transfer is not to the poor. It's really from the poor and the rich to the middle and upper middle classes. The second question is, where did the state get those resources? Probably from taxes. So you'd have to ask this question of the seen and the unseen, or the opportunity costs. What would people do if they had that resources themselves? They might pay for their own college education. They might invest. They might start a business. They might save money. They might provide education for their children. That is all cost if the state just keeps the money. Maybe a better alternative is to cut taxes on the working population, let them keep the money and do what they want with it. They probably have a better idea of their needs than some minister. If the money was the result not of taxes but of something like oil revenue, if you take a state like Saudi Arabia or Russia today, just swimming in oil revenues. The problem with that, and it's called the resource curse. States that tend to be financed by revenues other than their taxpayers almost never develop into democracies. Why? Because they have no incentive to pay attention to the needs of their own population. They have their own source of money. So the Saudi state is, as you might say, not very sensitive to the needs or wishes of the people there. They have all the money they could possibly imagine, and an unbelievably, fabulously corrupt ruling oligarchy in that country who talk, and I hate to be so brutal about it, but they talk about piety and religion in public, and in private their lives are dramatically different. Lots of Scotch whiskey is consumed by people who preach extreme forms of Islamic doctrine in public, and in private they behave quite differently because they can afford that sort of a life. In that case, better to try to eliminate that funding and not use it to create dependency. So I think that as a general rule, one should be opposed to the state dispensing resources. It generates all kinds of negative consequences in the form of dependency. What was the second part of the question, though? If I were to take the other side and be a critic of the liberal perspective, I think that probably one of the strongest arguments was the one given at a very deep level. The argument was the welfare state creates a kind of social solidarity among persons because we feel we're all members of this national state, the Malaysian state, the American state, Canadian state, whatever it might happen to be. So they're making a kind of a moral and emotional appeal. However, I don't find it convincing. And the reason is the actual experience of welfare states, it does not make people more feeling more solidarity. The consequence is very different, actually. It tends to make people much more grasping and greedy of getting the resources from the state, which is why we find most welfare state resources go to the middle and upper middle classes. They're not, in fact, going to the poor. They're going to the people who are much more able to manipulate the system. And as I pointed out, if I were in Canada and I had such a terrible illness and they tell me to go to the end of the line, I'm clever enough and articulated enough, I would get myself up to the front of the line. But someone who has a very modest and humble life, who didn't go to university, probably will not be able to do that.